Hi, my friend, Caleb Johnson here, and I have a huge question to ask you real estate investors. How would you rate your level of personal discipline on a scale of 1 to 10? If your answer is anything less than a 10, I've got something neat for you. And let me tell you, discipline means pushing yourself beyond your comfort zone and doing things that are difficult and sometimes boring. Achieving massive success requires you to do those difficult things. Building your levels of personal discipline is not easy, but it does pay off. In fact, you can't achieve anything significant without discipline. Now, I just released a program for investors where I walk with you as an accountability coach to aid you stay on track so you can push yourself to do the hard things that greatness is going to require of you. Starting is easy. Go to redccapitalgroup.com and click accountability coaching at the top right of the screen. So let's get to work, and now to the interview. How's it going, everyone? My name is Caleb Johnson, host of From Trial to Triumph. Today, I am very excited about our guest. His name is Kyle Gordan. Kyle has been in the counseling world for 30 years, and he has created, owned, and sold over 3 businesses, and he also is active in sales training and educating professionals. So, Kyle, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited to have you here. And full disclosure to the listeners that Kyle is actually my counselor, and he I consider him a life coach, and he has been a tremendous help in my life. So I really appreciate you, brother, for what you've done, and I know what you continue to do for the community. And for us to start, can you go ahead and give our listeners just a quick synopsis about you and just where you kind of started from?
Where I started from, I think a seed for counseling was born in me at a very young age. I grew up in the 50s and the early 60s, and that was a time when children, the prevailing attitude in regard to children is they should be seen and not heard. My father being a naval officer and an aviator, they were required to attend social functions, typically about once a month, sometimes a little more frequently. As we were new to Southern California, San Diego, children were allowed to attend with the parents. And my parents didn't like leaving us with babysitters, as they really didn't have any. So children were allowed to attend, but they were forced to sit on a couch off to the side where they were expected to be still and quiet without providing disruption. I have a very active mind, and I bore very easily. So to occupy my mind, I found myself paying attention to how people interacted with one another. And throughout the course of an evening, I could see how the men would talk to one another. I could see how the women would talk to one another. I could see how men would talk to women, spouses included. And then through the course of the evening, I could see how that changed as alcohol was applied to their time. And I could see a morphosis on conditions and attitudes and communication and conversation. So from a very early age, I spent an immense amount of time watching people, how they responded to the things that people said, and coming into a recognition. Oftentimes, if someone had said something a little bit different, their outcome would have been tremendously different. So that I could probably talk for a couple of hours on that. So I might just probably ought to leave that alone. But that birthed in me an interest that carried over into sales, carried over into sales and motivational speaking. It carried over certainly into my counseling practices. For me, the biggest part of communication or conversation is the listening aspect. I've got 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 1 mouth. I should use those things then on a 4-to-1 ratio. Eyes and ears over mouth. So I tend to watch, I tend to listen, but I don't hear. I've learned over the years to not just hear the explicit of what someone's saying, but I really listen to and tend to hear the implicit of what they're saying, what they meant by what they said. Too often times, conflict in communication or in sales, loss of sales, how you can apply it to almost anything, is the listener listened to the explicit statement that a person made, and they weren't listening to what they meant by what they said. And if they try to provide or answer the explicit, they're not addressing the root or the heart of the matter, and conflict can reside in sale in sales, it ends up being a not sale or a think it over rather than moving someone into making a positive decision that benefits both.
Mm.
In counseling, it's more of an aspect of people want to feel comfortable that they can bear their heart.
Mm.
So in counseling, the first several get-togethers, if you will, or sessions, are primarily someone testing the waters of, can I trust this person? So they'll provide subtle little statements that explicitly may not mean much, but implicitly can mean a great deal. So if I'm then in a position where I can tell them things about themselves that they've not divulged to me or they've not exposed to me, but yet I don't judge them, but I accept them just as they are, that breaks the barriers in most instances down to where we can really accomplish something in a conversational counseling aspect.
Mm. Mm. Wow. And I can say that I've experienced that, and of course never understood or realized that. But where I would like to first touch on is when you were first listening to these conversations with people when your father was at these banquets, and when you would listen to those people, what was one of the biggest things that stood out to you that you are able to apply to your life today?
Well, I would say there were cocktail parties in the 50s and 60s. So there would be evenings, cocktail parties. There may even be, there's typically a live band, soft band, and there'd be dancing. But, you know, I do enjoy a good glass of scotch from time to time. I'm not a drinker. I probably have a glass of scotch every 2 or 3 years. So that's the frequency of my drinking. But I've spent a lot of time, particularly with being at Teen Challenge, I've witnessed what drugs or alcohol can do to people, and in some regard, what it can do for people. So as a person has a cocktail or two, when they come into an environment where where it's a very social environment, almost everyone has an image that they want to portray, a look, an image, an attitude. And after a few cocktails or after a couple of drinks, the real individual starts to expose himself. And if you can pay attention to how that person presented themselves when they had the image they were trying to maintain, and then pay attention to them as some of the barriers start to fall a little bit, and they become a little bit more themselves, or a little less filtered, if you will, that's when you can get a window into who the person really is. Now, in counseling, as you're aware, when you and I talk, I can't suggest that you have a drink before we talk or before we start. But the same process can be accomplished to cause someone to relax and start to become more like themselves. I think the biggest conflict that exists, particularly in marriage counseling, is the trust wanes. There's a lack of trust, which always boils down to a lack of communication, because both parties, the husband and the wife, have a fear that if the other person knew me to the way I really, really am, they would no longer love me, or they couldn't love me. And that's reciprocal. So the husband and the wife, while they may be desperate, I've seen many desperately in love or genuinely in love, but yet they have conflict, and the conflict all boils down to communication. The communication conflict stems from a fear of allowing the other person to completely know them. And there's nothing more wholesome, there's nothing more fulfilling than to have someone know you for exactly who you are, but yet love you just as you are without you changing anything. And that's what becomes so dynamic with a relationship with Christ. There's nothing he ever asks us to change. We don't have to become anything. We don't have to do anything. We don't have to change anything. He accepts us and loves us and desires to lavish his love on us just as we are without change. And to desire to have a relationship with him. And it's in that relationship, when he's accepted us just as we are, that we find ourselves, in many instances, desiring to change for the better, desiring to change to become more like him. And that same dynamic applies then to marriages, when the two people can come together and accept each other where they're at, with all their faults and flaws, complete transparency between the two of them, and accept each other just as they are. It's then that the wife starts to see things that she always wished she could have seen from her husband, because now he desires to, it's a heartfelt desire to change. Not to change to please her, but because he knows it's the right thing to do. He desires to, if you will, fix things in his life or his personality or in his habits, and vice versa is true as well. Again, I could probably go on for a couple of hours, but I don't know how much information you want, so maybe I'll stop there and see where you want to go.
Yeah, no, that was great. And forgive my pause. You dropped a lot of impactful nuggets, but what I think was what stood out to me the most was, first, how Christ loves us, and that is unconditional love, right?
Yes.
Whenever you can find someone, very rarely, if we're blessed enough to have people in our life that do love us like that, that's a very rare thing to have a handful of people like that. And especially to have that spouse, that is very impactful. And so I know that's huge for people once they do actually find that.
You're right, and it is, I would say it is fairly rare, particularly between a husband and wife. But that doesn't mean that it isn't totally possible. It's the way it should be. It's rare that it is, but it's the way it should be. It's the way God created things, in essence, to be that completely transparent person. And when you consider, we all have things in our life that we just prefer not to be exposed. And when you can come into a relationship with the Lord and realize you can't hide anything from him, he knows it all. The scripture says, I knew you before you were born, and I called you by name. I lovingly knitted you in your mother's womb, and I created you, and that creation was with a hope and a plan, and that plan was to prosper you and bring you peace. The Bible says that he knows us to the very number of hairs on our head. We don't know ourselves that well. So that can be translated into saying he knows us better than we even know ourselves, but yet he still accepts us just as we are. Then that's almost impossible to do from one physical person to another, but we can come very, very close. And that's when the communication, the intimacy between a husband and a wife becomes something that I've had people tell me it's become otherworldly, because they just don't recognize each other anymore, and they're so infatuated with each other, and they're so desperately in love with each other, and they've been married for 20 years, and they're just now feeling this way. It's an amazing process.
Wow, Kyle, I'm just thinking about this, and I feel like we could talk for hours there's so many different things that I wanted to talk about, and I'm so excited to keep on talking about this with you. And I didn't plan on us talking about marriage. However, I think it is so impactful for one. We have two listeners on the show. They're either married or not married. And either way, if we talk about marriage, it's going to benefit people that are married, or it's going to benefit still the single person so that they can know what to look for down the road. So let's touch on that, marriage, a little bit, and how can someone find that relationship, or maybe even if they do have that relationship, how can they get to that level of unconditional love?
Well, it takes two, to answer your latter question first, it takes two people willing. They don't have to be at the same level. They don't have to have the same wants, needs, and desires, but they have to have a willingness to be transparent one with another. If one's willing to be transparent, but the other's still withheld, or withholding for some reason, or is guarded for some reason, the two will grow apart. It'll have the opposite effect of knitting them closer and bringing them into greater harmony. It will actually distance them, because the one's growing closer to being in the will of the Lord. They don't have to be at the same level. They don't have to have the same wants, needs, and desires. but they have to have a
It does.
willingness to be transparent one with another. If one's willing to be transparent, but the other's still withheld or withholding for some reason, or is guarded for some reason, the two will grow apart. It'll have the opposite effect of knitting them closer and bringing them into greater harmony. It will actually distance them because the one's growing closer to being in the will of the Lord. If you're looking at all the same places and you ain't finding anything, I think it is best to cease looking, to not be anxious, not be watchful, not be looking for whom I might be attracted to or whom I may not be attracted to or whom I'd like to spend time with or whom I just wouldn't care to spend time. In today's society, socially, we make it all about appearance and looks. And while that can be significant, I think you've heard of many couples who appear total opposites as far as their appearance, but yet they're uniquely woven in love and have a tremendous relationship. So if a person, instead of seeking whom he may date or whom may be good dating material or wife material or husband material, seek first to bring yourself into completeness with the Lord. As people, as you become more mature in the Lord, as you develop a greater understanding of His will and the walk that He would have you, the things that He would have your hands be busy about on a daily basis, as you seek those things, you're going to change. And you're not a year after, if I just put a time frame on it, if you spend a year seeking the Lord, seeking His will for you, and someone attempting to be more Christ-like, the things that are important to you as far as a companion are completely different at the end of that year than they were at the beginning, and will continue to be different until you come into a Christ-like maturity. And I think that's another reason why so many marriages fail today, even churched marriages, is they don't grow at the same rate. They're both not actively seeking to develop and strengthen their relationship with the Lord. They're not actively seeking the Lord's will in their life or for their walk. And when one becomes very assertive at doing that, and the other becomes maybe placid or just as along for the ride, then they're not changing. They're not morphing. Their spirits aren't changing or growing at the same rate. So they may be initially equally yoked, but from maturity level, one may become 40 years old while the other's still hanging on to being 25, if that makes sense. Doesn't mean it can't be corrected. Doesn't mean it can't be brought together, but for it to be brought together, for it to be corrected, has to have both of them come to a recognition that something's changed, something's different, and be willing to say, is it me? If it's me, I desire to change. Now, if they both have that, it's amazing how oftentimes that marriage can be rekindled, renewed, and refired. But if one is satisfied with the status quo and the other wants to seek growth, and one says to the other, well, you can go seek counseling, I'm okay where I'm at, it isn't going to happen. I know I'm destined to a year, 2 years from now, or maybe sooner, they're going to be in divorce court and they're going to be looking again for another spouse.
Is it okay to divorce?
Infidelity, physical cruelty, emotional cruelty. I think those are the only three things that could justify even the pursuance of a divorce. Whom God has joined together, let no man tear asunder. The scripture literally means, till death in this life do us part. And there's caveats for that. Even in the Old Testament, if we look at the Old Covenant, infidelity was a cause for divorce. Physical cruelty was not. However, Christian morals have kind of developed where physical or emotional cruelty, no one should have to sustain that. Now, I think the first course of action in that, except for in emotional cruelty, are they both willing to seek counsel? If the answer is yes, then let's seek that first. In other words, let's exhaust everything that we can exhaust before two people decide that we can't make a go of this anymore. So other than infidelity, even infidelity is healable. I've seen many marriages be healed and reconciled from infidelity. With infidelity is just a form of physical abuse, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
People don't look at it that way, but they're abusing themselves and they're abusing their spouse. That said, physical abuse is something that takes great care and counsel to try to overcome. And I would, myself personally, I'd never want to see, and typically it's the woman, be in an environment where she's subjected to physical abuse on a regular basis. She needs to be extricated from that. Maybe that individual needs to seek counseling on his own, or she needs to seek separation, divorce, whatever you want to call it. I mean, but other than those three things, I've never seen any conflict in a marriage that I haven't seen any conflict that I haven't also seen reconciled, including infidelity. It's again, it's the matter of the heart of the two people. Both have to be willing to seek counsel. Both have to be willing to be humble themselves before the Lord. Both have to there's certainly one that needs to seek contrition, but the other one has to be willing to forgive. And forgiveness in our lifestyle today, in the reality, forgiveness is something totally different than the way we look at it today. Someone could ask someone else for forgiveness, and they say, "Well, sure, of course I forgive you." But a month later, they bring up the same subject again. Particularly a wife with a husband, she'll say she forgives him for something, and he'll strive or struggle to do better and maybe stop that habit or stop that thing that created the ire or a conflict between the two of them. And no man is perfect. He may slip a little bit. He may give the appearance of doing something, repeating a process again, but yet the wife doesn't attack it as something brand new. And she does attack. She'll say, "You always do this. You said you would never do this again, and here you are." So that brings up a dynamic where forgiveness was never really given in the first place. Where God's forgiveness, He says, "I will separate you from your sins as far as the east is from the west." So if you consider that, if you're walking west, you can never see east. You could walk for the rest of your life. You can circumnavigate the globe any number of times you want to, and you're never walking east to do it as long as you strive to walk west. It's only when you turn around and walk the other direction that you're walking east. So what he literally says is, of course, God isn't going to be a forgetful God, but in his treatment of us, in his relationship with us, when we ask for his forgiveness, and he's free and willing to provide it, from his attitude toward us and his treatment toward us, it's as if it never happened, and he never remembers it again. He'll never throw it in our face again, even if we slip and fall in the same manner. He'll never say, "Here you are again," or "I'm tired of forgiving you for this thing. When are you going to?" He doesn't do that. Each time is fresh and new, and each time is as if it never happened before. That's a difficult process, emotionally speaking, between a husband and a wife. It's one that can be brought to, but it manifests itself most in infidelity. That's where the most pain, and it's typically, not always, but the preponderance of the time, is the man who's been unfaithful, and it's the woman who's hurt and crushed. But forgiveness can still come. But forgiveness isn't for, in other words, if I did something to you that would require my asking you forgiveness, my asking you forgiveness isn't for you. It's for me. So when I ask for forgiveness, if my heart's desire is for you to accept my apology or accept my whatever and to forgive me, that's an act for me, not an act for you. If you fail or if you choose not to provide it, it doesn't affect me. It only affects you. Then that affects you.
Kyle, can we talk about, hey guys, if you're enjoying the content of our podcast, but you have additional real estate investing questions, I'm happy to answer those questions for free. Head over to redseacapitalgroup.com and book an appointment with me. Not only am I the host of the show, but I am actively buying and already own properties across the US. So feel free to schedule a time that works best for you. Visit redseacapitalgroup.com to book your appointment today. What's the reason that is ultimately for your soul compared to mine? And I understand what the difference is, but I think it's for some people, if we clarify, that might help.
Well, if I've wronged someone in any way at all, God would have me humble myself before that person and ask for their forgiveness. That allows me to continue to hear from him. It allows me to continue to stay in his presence. It allows me to continue to hear and be a part of his will. If I choose not to ask for forgiveness, I'm separating myself from his will. And the more I get separated from his will, the harder and harder it becomes to understand him, and that's where people, there's a secular saying of backsliding. Well, that's one day you see a Christian who seems on fire for the Lord, and 5 years later he's sitting in a bar getting drunk every night. It's typically something like that has brought it to that end. There's failure to ask for forgiveness in the reciprocal process, the individual's failure to provide forgiveness, that leaves a seed of bitterness. If that person's still dealing with some kind of pain, some kind of hurt, that they find it hard or difficult or sometimes impossible to provide forgiveness. Well, that's going to harden that person's heart. And they're going to unwind in the same manner that if I were to fail to ask you for forgiveness, if you have aught with me, my heart is going to be separated from the Lord, just as yours would be if you failed to provide forgiveness.
Mm-hmm. And I know for me, whenever I've been reluctant into forgiving someone for something, that always, kind of like you said, Kyle, it creates bitterness in me towards that person. And then my whole personality actually changes, where it's more negative. It's more, it honestly hurts me more if I don't forgive that person because I'm holding on to that. And that is just a burden on my soul. And that shouldn't be the case.
And that's what transpires. And if left undealt with, it evolves into a wide variety of other things. Depression is not the least among it. I would say there's a great number of people who are very depressed, and the seed of it, the root of it, is long-held bitterness from unforgiveness. Undealt with bitterness, undealt with anger, unexpressed, unresolved. And almost all of it can relate back to some point with someone where they failed to provide forgiveness.
Wow, that's powerful. And I feel like, again, we could talk much longer, but I feel like we've reached a certain point where we should probably start asking the final three questions.
Okay.
And Kyle, if the first question would be, if you can recommend a book to our listeners to read, what would that book be?
I think well, for me, from my standpoint, from my walk, it would be the book of James in the Bible. That would be the number one book to read. I don't think that's the direction you're looking for.
Still a good recommendation, but if you do have another one on your mind, that let's do two.
I would say it would be pertinent to where the person needs growth. I think everyone needs, they may not want it, but they need to understand how to communicate better. And that most communication is a product of good listening and not good talking. So there are many books in regard to learning to communicate better. I suggested one to you the other day that's a very, very old book, and that's How to Master the Art of Selling Anything by Tom Hopkins. That's a book that on the surface you would not read it and think you're improving your communication. But in the reading of it and the application of it, you are most definitely improving your communication. But books on understanding, I think know yourself. So I think there's many people, particularly men, that really don't know themselves. They're not even willing to be transparent with themselves, much less a significant other. So that I think there's a wide array of self-improvement books, but it would almost be like if I were a doctor, there's no one book I could give you to read that's going to have you change to a healthy life. I don't know if you've got problems with colon, you've got problems with thyroid, you've got problems with sinuses, you've got allergies. I don't know. Mm-hmm. I'd have to discern where you can have the greatest impact with yourself. But I think if a person was transparent with themselves and they just asked of themselves, where's my greatest need? Where's my biggest weakness? And they choose to be transparent about that weakness, even if it's only to themselves. And then they look for some help, self-help, or look for some counsel someplace or some direction on what can I do or where can I go, that would have the biggest impact in regard to what I think you're asking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a great book, especially the book that you recommended to me. I can definitely attest to that. I would highly recommend that book to the listeners to pick up. Now, Kyle, is there a way that people can maybe learn more about you or just what you teach or maybe get in touch with you?
Well, I'd be happy for anyone to have my email address as an initial contact. Mm-hmm. I have started building a website. I don't think most people get to know people via a website, so it's not. It's almost ready to put live. It's Proverbs 20.5 is the name of the website, or 25. Mm-hmm. But I'm happy for anyone to have my phone number or my email address. If there's something in their mind that they feel like I could help them with, I would not be doing God's will if I denied any help I could be to someone if I denied that help. As far as a counseling relationship, anyone that would want to talk to me, the first and most important thing is for the two of us to spend some time together so that they can feel some surety that they're comfortable with me. There's no sense in them getting involved in any kind of an ongoing relationship with someone or going to any expense, if you will, unless they feel comfortable with the person that they're attempting to seek help from.
Mm, absolutely. And what's your email address for the listeners?
The simplest one is kdg@usa.com.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I'll be sure to put that in the show notes. And Kyle, if you can share one last thing with our listeners that you think they can take away from today's show, what would that be?
Be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Be not conformed to this world. Don't let this world's trials, troubles, tribulations deter you, get you down. Don't let your life's frustrations, but continue to renew your mind. Mm-hmm. There's a scripture that says, "Count it all joy, my brother, when you face diverse trials and tribulations." I've learned more from my failures or from trials or tribulations than I've ever learned from successes. And I know that when I face a trial, I don't look at it as a trial, I look at it as an opportunity. Because I recognize God is trying to show me something. There's something in this that God's trying to show me. Sometimes they're painful. So if they're painful, then I want to say to the Lord, let me not experience this and not learn everything that you would have me learn from it so that I never have to endure this pain again. But it's still for my growth, for my greater good, and for His greater glory. The renewing of your mind, I think, is the most significant thing. If you're not studying, if you're not learning something on a continual basis, then you're going backwards.
Wow. Praise God. Kyle, thank you so much for sharing that information. And I know spending your time here was a great blessing to me, and I know it definitely blessed our listeners. So thank you for being open to share and spending your time with us.
Anytime, Caleb. I appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Well, everyone, I hope you all have a great day, and we'll catch you at the next one.
It's time to grab your victory. Find us on the web at redseacapitalgroup.com and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Red Sea Capital Group.